Amen. Thank you so much, everyone, for your constant prayers. I really appreciate it. So today we're going to continue our examination of the seven bowls, which we begun last week, and it takes place in Revelation chapter 16. Now, last week we got through the first four bowls of wrath. This week I was hoping to finish the whole chapter, so to get through the fifth bowl of wrath, the sixth bowl of wrath, and the seventh bowl of wrath. However, I feel it might be a little bit too much information, a bit of information overload, if I try to rush through it and get through the whole chapter this week. And the reason being is that this week does focus on that important term, which you probably heard concerning the end times, and that is the concept of Armageddon. So I know there'll be a bit of time, and it'll be important for us not to rush through that particular concept. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get through the fifth bowl of wrath and the sixth bowl of wrath, look at Armageddon, and then next time we meet, which will actually be in 2 weeks' time. So I'll actually be away next week, so no study next week. But when we meet in 2 weeks' time, we'll look at the seventh bowl and we'll finish off the chapter. And also, I'll do a bit of an excursus looking a bit about what Jesus had to say about the end times and some of the parables in particular that he told, which help us to understand end times theology a little bit. So next week will be a bit of a special week where we'll finish off chapter 16 and the seventh bowl of wrath, but also look what Jesus has to say. Now, just to give a quick review of what we looked at last week. So we're in the section of the book of Revelation called the seven bowls of wrath. And I mentioned last week that the seven bowls of wrath continue and repeat some of the themes of judgment that we have already heard throughout the book of Revelation. And I cast your mind back to the weeks where we looked at the seven seals and the seven trumpets. And we mentioned that the types of things we saw in the seven seals, things like conquest, bloodshed, famine, disease, all of those sorts of things, political chaos, we see those themes repeated in a different way in the seven bowls. Also, the same manner in which we saw the seven trumpets talk about the judgment of God through the lens of that same plague-like language that the people of God were familiar with, because they came from a tradition of the book of Exodus where God poured out literal plagues onto the nation of Egypt. The seven trumpets, in the same way that the seven trumpets employed that plague-like language, the seven bowls of wrath also employ similar plague-like language. And what we've seen in chapters 15 and 16, which mark our the current section of the book of Revelation that we're in, what we see is that we're in this section where God is talking about a new and an eternal exodus, where thanks to the work of Jesus, we now are exited from the bondage of sin and death, and now we go into a new promised land, which in the Old Testament times, the bondage was in Egypt. In the New Testament times, the bondage is bondage to sin, and we are slaves to sin. And in the Old Testament, when they went from bondage in Egypt to the promised land, now in the New Testament, thanks to Christ, we go from that bondage, which is slavery to sin, and we go into the promised land, which is in the new kingdom, the new heavens and the new earth. So it's a new eternal exodus which is taking place. But just like God poured out judgment in the Old Testament during the Exodus, God is going to pour out judgment here in the New Testament. And these are the bowls of wrath that we're examining here. And I mentioned that the bowls of wrath, the image that John sees in his apocalypse, are the image of the same bowls that priests would use as part of their utensils when they sacrificed, when they would make a sacrifice and they would collect blood in these bowls, and they would pour the blood onto the altar as part of their sacrificial system. That's what we're seeing John envision here in chapters 15 and 16. This is all just a refresher for us. And I mentioned that the best way for us to understand the book of Revelation, which is this metaphor that I've been using, or this image that I've been using, is we imagine the book of Revelation is kind of like a picture that you might put on social media. You take a picture with your camera phone, and then you might apply all of these different filters to help you give all of these different filters which help you appreciate the picture through a different lens each time. And that's what the book of Revelation is doing. It's taking the picture of God's eternal victory and God's judgment and his righteous judgment. And it is giving us several snapshots into the judgment of God. We had the seven seals, which I said were like the announcement of God's wrath, the seven trumpets, which were a second filter, a second lens into the judgment of God, which is sort of the assembling that now is the time that wrath is coming upon. It's the same way that an army would blow trumpets to signal the start of the battle. And then the bowls represent the execution of God's judgment. So we have the announcement in the seven seals, the announcements in the assembling in the seven trumpets, and the execution in the seven bowls. And why is it seven? It's seven because God's judgment and God's wrath is perfect. And then last week we looked at the first four of these, and we mentioned that the first four of these bowls represent disease in the land as part of the judgment that was going to come, as part of the bloodshed and the war that was going to come in Jerusalem when Rome went to war with Jerusalem. There's going to be disease in the land. And we recognize that disease is a byproduct of warfare. When you have bodies rotting in the streets, what do you get? You get disease. The second bowl was a picture of death, how there was going to be tremendous bloodshed as a result of this. And we recognized, and remember that image was the image of the rivers running red, the rivers running with blood. And we recognize that that is a symbol in the poetry of the Old Testament to symbolize death. And then in the third bowl, we recognize that this was blood for blood, that the judgment was coming because in the same way that God's people had rejected him and had slain prophets in the Old Testament, and in the same way that they had slain his messengers in the New Testament, messengers like Stephen, messengers like Peter and Paul, and all of the messengers of God's people who had been slain, men and women who had been representing Christ, we recognize that the third bowl is a pouring out of God's wrath, and it is blood for blood. And then in the fourth bowl, we saw spiritual scarcity. We saw this image of there being the sun scorching people. And that was an image in the Old Testament or in the poetry of the Bible to symbolize spiritual scarcity or spiritual bankruptcy. That just like springs of living water were a good picture of healthy, vibrant religion, we saw that the figurative language of the sun scorching people was a figurative metaphor, a poetic metaphor to talk about spiritual drought. Just like when you had droughts in the Old Testament, they killed a lot of people. We recognized that the fourth bowl was a picture of spiritual bankruptcy and spiritual drought. And ultimately, we gave a window into how all of these things saw fulfillment in one way or the other through the actions of in the first century in what was known as the Jewish-Roman wars, where the Jewish people revolted against Rome and the oppression of the empire, and this led to warfare in which Vespasian and Titus came in and basically decimated. It was a scorched earth policy. They decimated Judea, the villages of Judea, and eventually they came to the temple and destroyed the temple, sacked the city, burnt the temple, and all of these things we keep reminding. We've looked at this, and it's just repetition, which is we've repeated time and time again. All of these things were things that Jesus predicted in the final week of his life in an event, in a sermon called the Olivet Discourse. The Olivet Discourse. It was a sermon, a speech that he gave on the Mount of Olives when he talked about the judgment of the temple and the destruction of the temple. And we recognize that when this fourth bowl was poured out, all of the key figures in who held dominant sway in the spirituality and the religiosity of the Jewish community in the first century, groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the high priest and the office of the high priest, all get disbanded as part of the judgment that God pours out, and there is spiritual bankruptcy. So this is just a reminder and a bit of a refresher of what we looked at last week. We noticed that these themes are repeating over and over again. And this week we will look at the fifth bowl of wrath, and then we'll go to the sixth bowl of wrath, and we'll examine that, and we'll examine the theme of Armageddon, which comes out of that. So if you're here just for the teaching of Armageddon, you just got to hold on a bit until we get to it. And then, like I mentioned, no Parkside Thursdays next week. The week after, when we resume, we'll look at the seventh bowl of wrath, and then also we'll look at the examination of what Jesus had to say about the end time. So everybody's with me? Are there any questions or comments about where we've gone to and where we're going? Sorry, where we've been and where we're going? With that being said, could somebody please read for us from Revelation chapter 16? And we're going to go from verse 10, and we will get all the way to the end of verse 16. From verse 10 all the way to the end of verse 16. So the fifth and the sixth bowls of wrath.
The fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and its kingdom was plunged into darkness. People gnawed their tongues in agony and cursed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, but they refused to repent of what they had done. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Then I saw three impure spirits that looked like frogs. They came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. They are demonic spirits that perform signs, and they go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for the battle on the great day of God Almighty. Look, I came like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and remains clothed, so as not to go naked and be shamefully exposed. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Now, as I've said, you're starting to get familiar, your spiritual muscle is starting to get stronger. So these themes you're going to find, as we looked at last week, they're starting to become a bit more straightforward and a bit quicker for you to pick up and grasp, because we're looking at these so often and we're repeating ourselves. We've kept a straightforward approach. We haven't changed that approach. There's nothing ad hoc about our approach. We've grounded our reading and our examination of the book of Revelation by stressing two key pillars. Number one, what is apocalyptic literature? How does it work? And number two, how would the first Christians have read this? And we've stuck consistent to that in our approach. There's nothing ad hoc approach. We're not jumping from this historical time period to that historical time period. We've kept a similar approach. Now I'm gonna scoot through the fifth bowl as quickly as possible so I can get to the good stuff in Revelation, in the sixth bowl of wrath. And you're gonna pick this up really, really easily. The fifth bowl will represent the imagery of the fifth bowl is going to communicate to us political chaos. Political chaos. We've already seen this before in the seven seals and in the seven trumpets. There's going to be political chaos, which is going to be a byproduct of the judgment of God. There's going to be political upheaval, and these will be events which surround the pouring out of God's wrath. And let's see how the logic gets us to the idea of political chaos. Verse 10, the fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and its kingdom was plunged into darkness. People gnawed their tongues in agony and cursed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, but they refused to repent of what they had done. And as I mentioned, we're seeing the judgment of God described through that plague-like language. Now, I mentioned last week that the plagues of Egypt were such a significant landmark moment in the history of God's people that forever from that time period, they started to understand the judgment of God, or whenever they wanted to communicate what God's judgment would look like, they took the literal plagues that God had dished out upon Egypt and they turned those into metaphors to help them understand God's judgment. And what we're seeing here in the fifth plague is darkness. There is darkness in the kingdom. And you will recall from your examination of the book of Exodus that darkness was the plague, the ninth plague of the Exodus. Remember when God said to Moses, stretch out your hand towards the sky so that darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt. So we notice here that same metaphor of darkness is featured here in the fifth bowl of wrath. Now, notice that the darkness, this particular wrath, is poured out on the throne of the beast. Now, you will recall when we looked at chapter 13, we recognize that in chapters 12 and 13, the book of Revelation, the apocalyptic imagery of the book of Revelation, employs what is almost akin to political cartoons. We see a picture of a dragon who was representative, who we recognized was a symbolic of Satan and the kingdom of darkness. Then we saw two beasts. One beast was a beast who was a picture, a caricature of Rome, and the second beast was a false prophet or a spiritual beast. Now we're going to see here that darkness is poured over the throne of the beast. And we recognized in chapter 13 that the beast was that caricature of Rome. So ipso facto, what is the throne of the beast? Well, the throne of the beast is the position held by the emperor of Rome. And at this particular time, the emperor of Rome is Nero. And what we would recognize here is that out of all of the plagues at the time of the Exodus, the ninth plague, or the plague of darkness, had a particular skew to it. You see, all of the plagues during the time of the Exodus were designed to show God's superiority over the pagan gods of Egypt. If you go back and you read the plagues one by one, whether it was the boils, whether it was the frogs, whether it was the Nile turning to blood, whether it was hail, whatever it was, what God was showing through those plagues is he was almost declaring his praises to Egypt. What he was saying to Egypt is, you think that your gods have control over the forces of nature? No, I am the one who has control over the forces of nature. Why was blocking out the sun so powerful? Why was it such a powerful omen, darkness? Because the chief god of the Egyptians, Amun-Ra, the sun god, was the chief god. Why was turning the Nile to blood so profound in those days? It was because the Nile was the breadbasket of the ancient world. The Egyptian god was responsible for actually making sure that the river Nile flooded every single year. The god Hapi was responsible for this. Why did God show his superiority? Why was the plague of death so profound? Because Osiris was the god of the underworld. So God was showing his superiority to the gods of the Egyptians. Every single plague targeted the Egyptian gods in some way to show that Yahweh, Israel's God, was the only true and living God, and all of the gods of Egypt were nothing but idols. Now, the ninth plague in particular had an interesting skew to it. You see, the ninth plague not only targeted the gods of Egypt, but it targeted Pharaoh himself. You see, Pharaoh in the psyche of the ancient Egyptians was regarded as a god. And every morning, Pharaoh would wake up and he would stand on the balcony and he would raise his hands, he would stretch out his hands to the heavens. And the idea that by doing this, the divine being was causing the gods to have favor on Egypt and causing the sun to rise. Now, this shouldn't surprise us that Moses' very actions signify a pot shot at Pharaoh, because what is he commanded to do? He is commanded to mimic what the Pharaoh would do on a daily basis. Stretch out your hands towards the sky. But instead of light appearing, darkness will appear. So the act of God plunging the kingdom of Egypt into darkness did what? It was a shot to the heart of Pharaoh's claims to divinity. And the same thing is happening here, that the kingdom is plunged into darkness in a metaphorical sense. What is God doing? He is showing the world that the Roman Empire, the beast, is not actually divine. And this is This is earth-shattering in a pagan culture which worships the emperors, in a pagan culture where in many of the communities, and all of the communities, in fact, that the book of Revelation was written to, the seven churches, they had seats of temples devoted to the gods. Augustus, Caligula, all of these beings, Julius Caesar. So this plunging of the beast's kingdom into darkness is an attack on the claim of the emperor. Everybody with me so far? Any questions or comments? We recognize here that the plunging of the kingdom into darkness represents political chaos and turmoil, and it reflects the language that we also heard in the fourth trumpet. Remember in the fourth trumpet when we read, the fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark, a third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. And we recognized back then that in the poetic language of the Old Testament prophets, that sort of language of the referring to the astrological bodies and referring to omens on the astrological bodies was poetic ways of saying that political powers are collapsing, and the superpowers, there's a dramatic shift in the landscape of superpowers, right? Imagine if I was to come out and say that there's going to be a third of the sun and a third of the moon, in a poetic sense, struck to refer to political turmoil in Australia. Well, that could refer to an election. It could refer to, political powers, prime ministers, cabinet ministers, and stuff being struck down and being humbled and being cast out. Well, that is the same way that people would have interpreted these sorts of things, because they saw signs in the astronomical world signs in the astrological world they saw as mimicking chaos below. This is why, if you remember in the birth story of Jesus, when Christ was born, the star appears in the sky, and King Herod does what? He interprets this as an omen, and he is disturbed as a result of that. Why? Because astrological signs were understood in ancient psyche to represent omens of shifts in the political order. And we see that when this language is employed time and time again in the Old Testament prophets and in the poetic literature, astrological symbolism represented political upheaval. So in the first century, how do we see the political chaos and the political upheaval manifest itself? Well, we have covered all of this already. You will remember that in the first century, there was a period of great and immense political instability. The growing volatility of Nero's character and his eventual suicide caused great tension throughout the Roman Empire. And it eventually led to the year of what was called four Caesars, where four Caesars take the throne, and each one of them is removed from power through a variety of means, and eventually Vespasian comes and restores stability. But there was a time period where Rome was extremely vulnerable. Their enemies sought to take advantage of the kingdom plunged into darkness. All of the vassal kingdoms who they had oppressed sought to take advantage of the instability. This is part of the reason why the Jews sought to rebel at this particular time, because they also saw instability in Nero's character. So it was a good opportunity to try to get out from the thumb of your oppressor. We see this even today. This is part of human behavior. Anytime there's instability behind the superpowers, those who are oppressed try to get out from under their thumb. So this happened. Now, Rome, a bit over 100 years before this time, had an incredible period of civil war. Incredible period of civil war. Julius Caesar was eventually assassinated, and eventually there was more civil war before Augustus restored power. Now, Augustus, Tiberius, and the like kept power for about 60 odd years. And then all of a sudden, Nero comes along. And because of his volatile, immoral character, The kingdom is once again plunged into darkness. Nero had to flee. He was chased down and they made him commit suicide or lest he be killed. And he famously killed himself and basically uttered those famous words, what an artist this world is losing, basically. And this plunged the kingdom into chaos. Now, can you imagine a country like Australia going through an immense period of, Australia, we've had relative peace here. We've never had a civil war. We have had, you know, bloodshed of Indigenous Australians early on, but we haven't had a civil war by proper definition, strict definition of a civil war. Now, could you imagine there being civil war in Australia, and then within less than 70 years, there being more political chaos? You can imagine that people were getting very antsy and very worried that after stability through Augustus, now suddenly there is instability. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing political chaos as the throne of the beast is plunged into darkness while the judgment comes over. And to demonstrate that this is not just something that I'm making up, the Roman historians of the day, historians like Tacitus, were so worried and so upset by the political turmoil that was befalling the Roman Empire at this particular time, that even they thought that something terrible was going on, and even they thought that the end of the world was coming. Just to give you a bit of an idea of what was some of the things that were happening around this period and in the decades that followed, you had situations where the temple of Jupiter, for instance, temple of Jupiter was destroyed by fire not too long after the events of the book of Revelation. Now, the temple of Jupiter was obviously the main god of the Roman Empire. Sorry, I made a bit of a blunder here. Sorry. The temple of Jupiter was destroyed in 83 BC, but it was also destroyed again shortly after the book of Revelation, the events of the book of Revelation took place. When the Jewish temple was destroyed, even though it was destroyed by Romans themselves, they kind of also took this to be a very bad omen as well, because here you had the temple of Jupiter and you also had the temple of the Jews, which was an ancient wonder. It wasn't technically one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, but it was so well regarded and so magnificent that it should have been one of the ancient wonders of the world. The only reason why it wasn't counted by the Romans as an ancient wonder or by the Greeks is pretty much due to anti-Semitism, or because it wasn't a pagan monument. But can you imagine, right? Imagine today if, say, hypothetically, in the space of a few decades, the Vatican and, say, the shrine of idolatry, the Kaaba in Mecca, were to be destroyed, right? Even your average political correspondent would be, pretty worried about some of the things that are going on in the world and some of the things that could lead to. So these are the sorts of political chaos, that was going on at this time. And remember, Jesus has predicted all of these things. He's given us a picture of all of these things. He said things like, kingdom will rise against kingdom. You will hear of wars, rumors of wars. And he says, but the end is not yet near. So this same political chaos is basically the picture that the fifth bowl of wrath is showing us here today. Now, are there any questions or comments in this, about this? Sorry, my computer was just freezing for 1 second. Okay, so let's now get on to the sixth bowl. And the language, the apocalyptic, the visionary language of the sixth bowl of wrath, we're going to see stands for military invasion. And again, we have already seen this theme of conquest and military invasion and bloodshed crop up on multiple occasions already. But let's see how it plays out here. And what you'll see is the pouring out of the sixth bowl introduces this theme that a lot of people know when it comes to the book of Revelation. It is the theme of Armageddon. I think if you were to ask lay people or Christians who haven't done in-depth studies of the book of Revelation, and you want to get them to describe or to talk to you a little bit about what they envision the end times to be, they're going to throw out words like apocalypse, the beast, the mark of the beast, 666, antichrist. They're going to throw out themes like Armageddon. You probably have a lot of people recite the word Armageddon, and you probably wondered what Armageddon is all about. So just by a show of hands or by some sort of expression, who here has wondered what Armageddon is all about, or they've heard that particular theme mentioned? And as you know, that one of the things I've been trying to do throughout this series is examine the pop culture side of things that we have heard and try to deconstruct some of those terms like Antichrist, Mark of the Beast, all of those sorts of things. And we're going to do that today. Now, as a bit of a preface, when I comment on Armageddon, the line of reasoning that I go with might be something that will sound very, very foreign to you at first, but I trust me, stick with me because it will make sense. But let's do a bit of hard work to get there first. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Now, this language is language we have already encountered here in the book of Revelation, and we've already deconstructed some of this language when we've looked previously. When we looked at the sixth trumpet, for instance, we recognized that something in the poetic language of the book of Revelation refers to the Euphrates, and it's got something to do with a military invasion. Now, here, the drying up of the Euphrates kind of recalls our attention, not entirely, but kind of to the parting of the Red Sea, where we had the waters pushed back and Israel was allowed to cross on dry ground. Now, think about that image for a second. Remember, we are in the world of this Exodus motif, this Exodus metaphor, where, as I mentioned before, God is leading a new Exodus. And just like in the Old Testament, what happened to waters? They were pushed back so that God's people could cross on dry ground. Now we are seeing a reversal of that. We're seeing God use this same drying up, this same pushing back of waters in order to bring judgment on his people. So whereas it was once liberation for God's people, now it is judgment for God's people. And what is happening now? Instead of the people of God crossing to get out of bondage and slavery, now you have God parting waters, so to speak, for a military invasion or an army who is going to invade the once promised land. Does this image make sense to you? The comparison that I'm drawing here? We read when we looked at the sixth seal, it said to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates, and the four angels who had been kept ready for this very hour, and the day and month and year were released to kill a third of mankind. Now we recognize that the imagery of that was to do with military conquest, and now we're seeing an invasion being forecast here. Now, as this map I have on screen shows, this particular region, the region of the ancient Near East, was dependent on two very important river systems, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The word to describe the region, Mesopotamia, depicts that very concept. Meso meaning between, and Potamia, river. So what is Mesopotamia? Mesopotamia, literally between the two rivers, is what we're saying. Now, the Euphrates River and also the Tigris were obviously important bodies of water, but they also provided a natural defensive barrier for lands in the south. Now, on the map, you can't see Israel, but Israel is further south, what would be uh, west of Jordan, right? You can imagine any army coming from the east. So when Babylon was a threat in modern day Iraq, or the Persians when they were a threat in modern day Iran, or the Assyrians in modern day Turkey, any army coming from the north or the northeast into Israel would have to cross the Euphrates River. So the Euphrates and the Tigris provided almost a natural defensive barrier for the people of God, because invading armies would have to navigate around the river. Now, when Israel's monarchy was at its peak during the time of the great kings like David and Solomon, their empire stretched even as far as the Euphrates. Now, what we're seeing here is that the great river Euphrates is dried up. So what does it mean if the river Euphrates is dried up? It means that natural defensive barrier is no longer there. Now, we have touched on that before, so this should just be a refresher for you, that Euphrates River, that natural barrier, is no longer there, right? Australia, what is the massive natural barrier that Australia has? We are an island. We're surrounded by water. So people cannot launch a land invasion of Australia. They've got to come through a navy to get to Australia. We've also got a natural barrier in the sense that we are further away, which means rockets have to be more equipped and more advanced in order to target us. That doesn't mean that we're infallible. It doesn't mean that we are invulnerable to attacks. No, it just means that it's harder for nations to attack us. So what we can see here is that both Vespasian and Titus, if they were coming to attack Israel, they would have been coming from the northwest of Israel. But what we need to recognize is that Israel, when Vespasian and Titus and their respective forces attacked the land of Judea, because Rome was in the midst of that political chaos, they couldn't just rely on Roman legions. They had to rely also on a mercenary army from other kingdoms that were under their influence. So what you'll see is, notice it says the kings from the east. This mercenary army who Titus employed came from different parts of the Roman Empire. So from the point of view of God's people in Judea, they were being attacked by enemies who were coming from different directions, kings who were coming from the east. Now, you might be wondering, well, this doesn't all make entire sense. I mean, wasn't the emperor the king? How could you have other kings from the east as well? Well, we've got to remember that although the emperor was the chief king, Rome did allow regions, Rome did install rulers and kings to localized areas of kingdoms who they conquered, right? King Herod, for instance, was the ruler of Judea. He was king of the Jews. So the Romans would have these vassal kings who they would allow to maintain their kingship in order to keep control over their empire. You can't just rule entirely from Rome. So Rome employed mercenary armies and mercenary kings who were part of their empire in order to wage this war, because the Roman legions were tied up in Rome, keeping stability. Does this make sense to everybody? What is going on here? The drying up of rivers, or the damming of waterways, was an important military tactic employed in the ancient world to allow soldiers to more easily invade countries. When Joshua invaded the promised land, when he crossed to get to Jericho, what did God do to the Jordan River? He supernaturally dammed the river so that the people could cross over into the promised land. So he aided them in their military tactics in order to invade the promised land. Now, think back to that Red Sea crossing. We have God damming the waters to allow the invading army to cross through. So the most famous example in the ancient world of this military tactic being employed was a very legendary example, so to speak. It was when Cyrus the Great captured Babylon, right? It was a sheer ingenious military tactic. If we were to make a list of all of, or some of the great military generals of all time, right? Cyrus would definitely be right up there with some of the best. He was, and his army were ingenious military tacticians. And if we were to make a list of some of the greatest military tactics of all time, well, certainly Titus's conquering of Babylon was right up there. Now, Babylon was virtually, almost in one sense or the other, impenetrable. It had this incredible war system where to penetrate the walls, you could drive chariots on the walls, which means you could position your charioteers, if you even wanted to, or your archers on the walls. But not only that, Babylon is in modern day Iraq. And what did Babylon have running right through it? The Euphrates River. So Cyrus, through his engineers, puts out this incredible military tactic where he basically dams the Euphrates. He builds a number of canals, canals. He builds a number of waterways, right? And he siphons the water off through these canals, and that allows water to be diverted, and it allows his troops to cross on relatively dry ground. So this is an incredible military tactic. And what we have here now is we have God, in a metaphorical sense, God is alerting and warning his people and saying to them that your time is up. I'm going to make the way possible for this great military invasion where the Roman Empire and its mercenary kings and its mercenary army are going to invade the land of Judah. And this is basically what this sixth bowl represents. Does this make sense to everybody? Any questions or any comments at this point? And one thing I should add is that Isaiah 11, right, although Cyrus is the human agent who does this great military tactic, Isaiah predicted this, that Isaiah predicted the downfall of Babylon when he said in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 15, the Lord will dry up the gulf of the Egyptian sea with a scorching wind. He will sweep his hand over the Euphrates River. He will break it up into 7 streams so that anyone can cross over in sandals, right? Notice what it says. It's almost describing the military tactic centuries before Cyrus will do it, right? The river will be broken up into streams, right? That's like how Cyrus and his engineers channeled the water and diverted the water so that anyone with sandals could even cross on it, right? It was very impressive, that what God is saying is that I am the sovereignty who is allowing all of this to happen. And whereas Isaiah 11 was predicting the downfall of Babylon, anybody who heard this sort of language of the great river being dried up, they would have imagined Isaiah's prediction of the fall of Babylon. What we are seeing now in Revelation is the downfall of the new Babylon. And remember a few weeks ago how we described the new Babylon? Who was the new Babylon? Jerusalem was the new Babylon, the adulterous people of God. So just like God allowed the river Euphrates to be dammed and diverted so that Cyrus could conquer the old Babylon. Now we have the New Testament Babylon, the same thing happening to them. So can you see how this consistent approach we've been taking is starting to fall into place, and the same building blocks are being repeated?
Yeah.
So when you heard that phrase kings of the east, you'd be tempted to think of the Parthians at this point. But like I said, that phrase kings of the east rather refers to that mercenary army and the provincial leaders, some of whom who retained their kingship titles. Rome allowed them to retain their kingship titles. The kings of the east refers to those mercenary armies and the mercenary rulers. And there were literally hundreds and thousands of them there were literally thousands of them who came and who helped Titus, who Titus employed during the siege of Jerusalem. So often our temptation is, well, people's temptations would be to refer to these kings as modern kings or modern rulers. But as we have maintained, and we've been very consistent in our interpretive philosophy, that how the earliest readers would have seen this was through its fulfillment in first century times, and this was through Titus's mercenary army. And in fact, Titus's mercenary army got a little bit out of control. When they got to Jerusalem and the siege, and they got through the walls and they crossed over, Titus recognized that the temple in Jerusalem was a magnificent piece of infrastructure. He actually didn't want to burn it to the ground. He wanted to rededicate it as a pagan temple. But the mercenary army got in there first and sacked the place and burnt it to a crisp. And he wasn't entirely happy about this. But what I want to recognize here is a quotation from Josephus, who was a historian, who we mentioned time and time again was an eyewitness to these things. He was a Jewish person who defected to the Romans and was spared as a result, and he became a Roman historian. And in his wars in book 7, in chapter 1, he writes this. Now notice what he says. He says, and this is referring to the basically the part of the war when Rome had dismantled and destroyed the city. He said, and when he had stayed there days among the principal commanders, and so long feasted with them, he sent away the rest of his army, referring to Titus, to several places where they would be everyone best situated. So in other words, what Josephus is saying is, once the battle was won, once Jerusalem fell, Titus celebrated for a while with the mercenary armies and the different commanders of the legions, but then he sent them back. He redeployed them to other parts of the empire, which is logical. But notice what he says. He says, but permitted the 10th legion, so the 10th Roman legion, to stay in Jerusalem and do what? As a guard at Jerusalem. And notice what it says next. It says, and did not send them away beyond where? Beyond Euphrates, where they had been before. So in other words, there were individuals, there were legions, there were mercenaries coming from across the Euphrates. Titus sent them back. But what Josephus shows here is clear indication that what Revelation is saying literally came true. Kings from the east came into Jerusalem. And this shows it here that Titus did not send them back, this one particular legion, back to the Euphrates. He allowed them to stay deployed in Jerusalem for obvious strategic regions. You don't want to sack a city and then let the people come back and rebuild it. So any questions or any comments surrounding this notion of military invasion?
Mm-hmm.
Verse 13, my apologies, verse 13. Then I saw 3 impure spirits that looked like frogs. They came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. Now, frogs obviously remind us here of the second plague in Egypt, when first you had the first plague, the river Nile turned to blood. What happens to the amphibians? Well, fish die, but frogs who can live on land as well swarm up out of the Nile and out of the river systems. So we kind of have a repetition now as part of the 6th bowl of wrath, also of the frogs. Now, it says in Exodus 8:6, so Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters, of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land. Now, notice these are not literal frogs, they're symbolic, and they are symbolic for impure spirits. So this would remind us of the fifth trumpet, where the forces of darkness come up out of the abyss, and the diabolical forces of darkness, Satan and the demons, are sitting behind some of the oppression and some of this judgment, which is, not by some of the forces of darkness and Satan are sitting behind the evil and the atrocities that are happening in Judea at this particular time. Because the people of God have rejected their God, because they have rejected Christ, they are now given over to the demonic forces whom they worship. Now, notice what it says. It says, out of the mouth. This imagery of out of the mouth, well, the imagery mimics the way frogs open their mouth. And frogs in general were generally a negative symbol in the ancient world. Now, the images which we encounter in verse 13 are images that we've seen before. In verse 12 and 13, we see that the enemies of God are epitomized by those caricatures: the dragon, the caricature of Satan, the two beasts we saw in the book of Revelation from last term. The first beast we already mentioned was Rome. The second beast represented what? It represented an internal spiritual beast, which the book of Revelation will call the false prophet. And the internal spiritual beast is a support system to both the dragon and also the first beast, in the sense that it wages war against the people of God. So who did we say were these spiritual beast in the first century? Well, we recognized that it was the false prophets and the religious teachers who were leading people astray. We have no king but Caesar, they enticed the people to say. Who were the false prophets in the first century? Well, remember, Jesus said, many will come claiming to be me. Many will come saying, I am the false Messiah. The Gospels talk about Jesus predicting this. And that is the caricature for the false prophet in the book of Revelation, the second beast. So the phrase out of the mouth is a reference to false prophecy and the inciting of violence. And what we saw in the first century was that the false prophets and the false religious teachers sort of aided the people in this intoxicating, fallacious belief that God was with them and they were going to avoid this judgment. All the big political players like the Essenes, players like the Zealots and the false messiahs in the first century, sort of lulled the people into a false sense of security. Rome isn't going to attack us. Rome isn't going to defeat us. Now is the time for God to vindicate his people. Now is the time for the Jewish people to revolt. The Zealots, we have a strong enough army. They burnt the food supply because they thought that God was with them and that he would miraculously deliver them. Their early successes early on in the war, they took this as a false sign that God was with them. So they would entice the people to violence, and it was almost an orgy of false prophecy and violence as the false prophets in the first century tried to lead the people astray. Brothers and sisters, the same thing happened in the Old Testament when you had prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah predicting the downfall of sinful Israel. The people didn't listen to them. Instead, they listened to the false prophets, and the false prophets who were rising up and leading their people astray. And all of the prophets that God raises up, Jeremiah talks about that the lying prophets in Jeremiah 23, he says, both prophet and priest are godless, even in my temple. I find their wickedness. And it talks about them prophesying in the name of Baal, committing adultery, and leading the people astray. Verse 16 says, do not listen to what the prophets are prophesying to you. They fill you with false hopes. They speak visions from their own minds, not from the mouth of God. They keep saying to those who despise me, the Lord says, you will have peace, and to all who follow the stubbornness of their hearts. They say, no harm will come to you. But which of them has stood in the counsel of the Lord? So basically, we see an orgy of false prophets in the first century. And I could go into details elaborating on this, but I've done it before. That there was an orgy of false prophecy arising at this time. And here we see this idea of these impure spirits, right? Who are the impure spirits? Jesus had driven them out when he had cast out demons from people. And now what were people doing? They were allowing to their own sinful nature. They were giving themselves over to false prophets, and false prophets who don't represent God. Who do they represent? They represent the mouthpiece of Satan and the forces of darkness. So all of this is going on behind the scenes now in this military invasion. You know, if I could liken it, just to give you a bit of a contemporary example, just to see how this plays out a bit, right? Think about the propaganda of Nazi Germany when Germany was going to fall. They still maintained right up until the time of surrender, right up until the time of their defeat, even when Russian troops were at the gates of Berlin. There's going to be great liberation. Hitler, put forth this idea that his people were developing a great military weapon to turn the tide of the war. This is kind of the orgy of false prophecy going on in the first century, and we see that all of these images, the dragon, the beast, the false prophet, are all tied up in this great wickedness and this great rebellion from God's people. That is the reason and the rationale behind the judgment. Any questions or comments there? I know I scooped through all of that very, very quickly, but I hope it makes sense.